We've reached the end of another season of Bring Back V10s, but don't get too sad just yet because we're signing off in style with another top 10 debate. And this time we're debating the biggest rivalries of the V10 era. As you might expect, many of the biggest names from the 90s and noughties will feature heavily, so this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm your host, Glenn Freeman, and as always, I'm joined for our now traditional end of series debate by Matt Beer, Ben Anderson, and Ed Straw. Matt, let's quickly set the scene a bit here. What makes a great rivalry for you, other than, of course, someone taking issue with Nigel Mansell?
Oh, straight into Mansell. Excellent. So two factors. Angsty tension. It's got to have a bit of needle about it. And not equivalent talent, but near enough that you know it's a real contest.
Ben, what do you want from a great rivalry?
It's got to be high stakes. It's got to be enduring. It can't be a flash in the pan thing. Ideally, you've got a bit of on track and off track to it. There's some animosity, which is something Matt mentioned with Needle. And it's got to have kind of some iconic element to it. It's got to have consequences that go just beyond itself.
Nice. Ed, presumably you're disappointed that Gabriele Tarquini versus qualifying for races wasn't included in our shortlist.
Well, I did try and lobby for that sort of thing, just as I tried to lobby for Matt Beer versus Nigel Mansell, but didn't get anywhere on those. But yeah, I think in terms of rivalries, you are looking for high stakes. I know Ben's already said that one. You're looking for a personal element. You're looking for real competition, and it needs to be consequential. It needs to be mattered. It needs to be remembered and be enduring as well, as Ben said. So it needs to be sustained with multiple chapters. I'm a little bit worried I'm a little bit on similar ground to Ben here, which is never a good place to be.
Get off my turf, Ed.
These episodes. But I think people know I love a stat, and I think this is something that very much defies any kind of statistical analysis. It's very much, I think, storyline based.
Yeah, so you're outside of your comfort zone, which is maybe why you've ended up on Ben's turf. I love that Ben's being protective of his turf, whereas Ed's going, well, I don't want to be on your turf. I'm petrified of aligning with you in the top 10.
Too many vibes.
A stop clock is right twice a day, isn't it? So sometimes Ben will be right.
I mentioned the shortlist there. It was actually much shorter than usual for this one, as we only had 12 rivalries to choose from. We usually tend to have sort of 15 to 20 on our shortlist. But when a rivalry you're desperately hoping we include hasn't made the cut, don't get annoyed, because if you're in our members club on Patreon, you'll be able to suggest rivalries we missed for an exclusive bonus episode where we'll discuss your suggestions. And if you're not yet part of the members club, now is a great time to check it out, as we have a pre-season offer running where you can get 90% off your first month. So head to the link in the description of this episode to get involved. And while you're there, you can also check out our new Bring Back V10s debrief, where I take member questions after each episode. Plus, there are lots of other benefits and bonus content from the race. At 90% off, what have you got to lose by trying it out for a month? Let's get going then. And in 10th place, we have Juan Pablo Montoya versus Ralf Schumacher. Only one of us voted for this, but it was enough to get it in just ahead of David Coulthard versus Michael Schumacher, which we all voted for. The only person who chose this one was me. And I put it 5th in my list. Nobody else included it, so there's not really any point me throwing to one of you guys before I've justified myself. My reasoning is, across what's now 11 seasons of Bring Back V10's research, it just comes up again and again that these two really did not like each other. They spent most of their time as teammates actively working against each other. We've had so many Williams insiders appear on the show, and I've read books and all these interviews from Williams people. They all have stories about how incompatible these two were as teammates. And they even had the decency to occasionally collide or have sort of fallings out and disagreements on track as well. So I was really interested that none of you guys included it. I wouldn't necessarily expect people to put it as high as I did. But for me, it was a no-brainer to have it in there. And for the reasons I've just outlined there, I put it 5th. Matt, I'll throw this to you, but the same question applies to everybody. Was this even close to making the cut for you? And if not, why?
Well, no, it was. I actually thought I'd put it 9th or 10th, to be honest. I'm quite surprised I didn't put it in. I do these things quickly and fire them in so I don't kind of overthink myself with them. The reason I wouldn't put it any higher than I did, which is obviously 11th, it turns out, Ralph just wasn't quite good enough. That's my clincher with it. Great rivalry in terms of there was endless angst about it, and they did crash into each other, and it was a nice subplot to the other rivalry involving Montoya that I hope does appear pretty high in this list. But it just didn't. The stakes weren't high enough because Williams was never actually properly fighting for a title, apart from for about a month in 2003 when it kind of pretended to briefly. And it didn't ever really feel like an equal fight. You always just felt like if Montoya actually just sorted himself out, he'd blow Ralph away. So, yeah, it was fun, but it was almost more annoying than fun because Ralph could be really petulant in how he did his side of the rivalry. So that's why it turns out I put it 11th, where I thought I put it about 9th or something.
Yeah, it fell out of mine for similar reasons, in that I just didn't feel it was consequential enough, in that it was great. It ticks a lot of the boxes, and my kind of gut feeling was, oh, that was a really good one. But yeah, it's not for a championship. It's just two teammates who don't get on, albeit running at the front and winning races sometimes. But it didn't have that extra edge to it, and that's what cost it for me. And I think if you asked a lot of people just to talk about the biggest rivalries, I don't think that one would leap to mind very often for people. So it just doesn't quite qualify because of the stakes, I think.
Yeah, they almost basically completely passed me by in terms of my memory of that period. Like, it's a known thing that they didn't get on. But I think that element of it being kind of wrapped within Williams, but Williams also not being properly in the championship hunt. If you take Hamilton and Rosberg at Mercedes, they were teammates that didn't get on, but the stakes were properly high for them while they're having this kind of rivalry that was existing only within a team. Whereas for like Montoya and Ralph, that wasn't the case. The stakes weren't high enough. And like Matt said, I just think like Ralph wasn't really in that same bracket, so it wasn't a fight between equals, which I think is quite important when you're assessing the rivalries.
I think Ralph is underrated a bit. I did at the time. I was very much more pro Montoya, but I actually think Ralph, although they were both drivers.
We had this in our Williams drivers debate,
yeah.
didn't we? It's a big edge straw defence of Ralph Schumacher.
Exactly. I think they're both drivers who could be very good. They had flaws, and they kind of equaled out to a similar kind of level for me in the end, which is probably one of the reasons why their rivalry was so chippy throughout.
Ed, you saying earlier that it was just basically two teammates who didn't get on just made me think straight away. This is Sergio Perez and Esteban Ocon, but they had briefly had a better car, and one of them was actually really quite good. And no one's going to remember Perez and Ocon in 20 years' time, are they?
Hey, I think that's the thing. It's not going to be one that people really leap to, as interesting as it is. I mean, you could do a great Bring Back V10s episode plotting the whole rivalry, although I don't think Glenn would involve prepping the full.
That'd take forever.
But setting you up for that one. But yeah, so it just didn't matter enough.
I think that's one of the elements that's interesting is Glenn, having researched so many episodes, sees it come up. I mean, obviously, none of us do the same level of research as you do.
It's in my veins.
And maybe it's one of those stories that's just a bit more kind of insidery rather than something that really permeates the kind of wider consciousness. I guess it was obviously a big deal at the time and to a certain extent, but like Ed was saying, it doesn't kind of endure. You don't immediately think of them as one of the kind of big rivalries of the era. You just think of it as a kind of pair of teammates that didn't get on, which, you know, you could say about a lot of teammates, in fact.
I'm willing to accept some of those arguments. I think it's clear listening to all of you talk that, yeah, if these two had fought for a championship as teammates, it probably would have got in. I can accept that. I do think whichever one of you said that, you know, it wasn't, you know, it's not something everyone remembers as a mainstream rivalry. I thought that was what we were here to do, is remind people, you know, I would say that our number one is quite predictable, but beyond that, it's quite varied. But I didn't think we were here to just talk about all the obvious ones. Anyone can do that.
Yeah, but that being obvious is baked into, for me anyway, it's baked into the question of the greatest rivalries, because I think it does transcend that world. Because I think if you were to pick the 10 most kind of intense rivalries, regardless of the tapestry it's painted on, if you like, you don't paint on a tapestry, you weave, but dodgy metaphor aside,
this is going well.
I think that you can find lots and lots of lower level ones that were just as acrimonious, but just didn't matter as much. So
yeah,
I feel that you're right. We're not talking about some of the less obvious ones, but I think we have to talk about the obvious ones. That was my interpretation of the question, anyway. But you can go different ways. So I don't think you're wrong to have had them so high, because everything you say about it is right. It's just a slight difference in the definitions and the approach we take to it, I think.
You've set me up there for my obligatory mention of the fact that, yeah, when I send you the list and I tell you what the topic is, I always say interpret as you wish. There is no defined interpretation of what the question means because that makes the debate more interesting and gives us a bit more variation. Let's move on because none of you guys, no one else picked this one. I am going to take issue with it was just Sergio Perez versus Esteban Ocon in a slightly better car. I'm not having that. Ninth place, we have Nigel Mansell versus Ayrton Senna. We all picked this one. Matt and I had it 10th in our lists. Ben had it 7th and Ed had it 6th. Ed, why did this one rank so highly for you?
Yeah, this one's quite a weird one because it perhaps wasn't as fully consummated a rivalry as some of them, in terms of the fact that there wasn't quite the same intensive title battle between the two of them. There was that in '91, but there were just so many flashpoints, and I think basically those well, it's sort of, I was going to say the big four and include PK, but really in the Bring Back V10s era, it's those big three in that period, isn't it? They've all got these great competition and rivalries going on between them, and I think it was very also personal, I think, for them as well, because Mansell and Senna both be stunningly quick. Mansell obviously had the perennial Mansell kind of chip on his shoulder about not being regarded as highly as some of them, and they just love to have incidents and controversies together. You know, that one at Adelaide '92 is one that just springs to mind, when it was just looked like it might be the last time they raced together in Formula One, and it was the last time they raced together in Formula One. They had to have a collision. So even though it's not quite in the upper echelon, I just think that the magnitude of those two drivers, two of the proper big beasts of the era, I think that it's a proper, this town ain't big enough for the both of us, which is why it got sort of to the top of what I'd call Class B of my list. I've got kind of a Class A and a Class B in my list. There's sort of a bit of a split, and the Class A is the ones that really do kind of step into proper legend. So this one, I don't feel it was 100% fully realised. I'd have loved to have had a proper kind of tooth and nails championship fight between the two of them, but we never quite got that. But we did get that. We got some way to that in '91, but the nature of the season means it wasn't quite there. I just think it's just one of those ones. There's so many flashpoints with those two over the years.
Ben, you weren't far behind Ed. Do you concur with that? Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's quite similar. I think what Ed was saying about us being on similar turf. Similar for me, there's a kind of cut-off point, and I would put this one towards the top end of what I would call the sort of more respectful or like docile rivalries, if that's the right word. Like there was a healthy amount of respect between the two drivers. It ticks a lot of the other boxes in terms of being quite consequential for that period. Ed's right in saying there wasn't quite the fully realised title fight, but they were the closest thing to the two main title contenders, while either McLaren Honda were the best thing in town or Williams Renault were the best thing in town. It wasn't really the animosity. That's the thing that kind of drops it down for me. You need like proper needle. They were flashpoints, but I feel like actually they kind of quite liked each other. Senna thought Mansell was one of the sort of more expressive drivers, and he kind of valued that, showing your emotion in the way you drive. So that's what kind of knocks it down for me. I think if they'd hated each other in the way that Mansell and PK did, then this rivalry would go right near to the top of my list. But the fact that they were kind of quite chummy, I think, knocks it down. It limits its potential.
Not going to be as Mansell negative as you'd expect here, because I didn't knock this one down to wherever I put it, just out of pure like, it's Mansell. For me, yeah, absolutely. For me, let's just say now, because this could be quite a Mansell episode. I put him first in the Williams debate. So I'm just going to put that, I'm not just, the Mansell tax is not that heavy. But anyway, the big thing for me with this one is Prost was there too. And that just took the sting out of this one. If Prost hadn't been there, I think the Mansell-Senna thing could have developed into a really proper rivalry. Because, I agree that they were kind of on more similar emotional turf. But they would have had so many more flashpoints if they had been the big two in the era, that it would have got really personal and unpleasant, probably, because of the extremes of their characters. But Mansell was too busy being really acrimonious with Prost when they were at Ferrari. Senna was way too busy having the scale of rivalry he was having with Prost. And that just kind of made Mansell the other guy, like the third wheel in the really fractious, collapsing relationship. So it was the sideshow, but it could have actually been it could have been a top top 3, top 5 rivalry had Prost not been there sucking all the rivalry up.
You've hit upon something there that I think Mansell always hated as well. That element of feeling like he was considered less than to Senna and Prost during this era.
Well,
The thing, yeah, the thing for me, I know Ben talked about like there probably was an element of respect there. I don't know if that's because Senna felt that he had Mansell covered from a talent point of view, but
took pity
on him. yeah. The reason, I mean, I only put it 10th, but the reason it got in for me was I liked the fact that Mansell was one of the few drivers who was prepared to stand up to Senna on a regular basis. You know, they had collisions often because Mansell was prepared to race Senna, the way Senna raced other people. They had their iconic cleaner moments like Barcelona 91. You know, what I love about that is the fact that you can see them both like looking outside the cockpit. They're basically looking down at their front wheels to make sure they don't touch, so they could race clean. But yeah, I feel the thing this was missing was a full-on title fight, because 91 was kind of, can Mansell catch up? No, he can't. 92, Mansell's got a massively dominant car. We didn't get that proper head-to-head season where I think they would have fallen out and they would have collided more, and that would have been absolutely epic. Let's move on to 8th place, and we have Nigel Mansell again. This time against the very recently mentioned arch nemesis of Ayrton Senna, and that's Alain Prost. Ben had this up in 4th. Matt had it 8th. Ed had it 10th, and I didn't include it. Ben, Mansell v Prost as the 4th biggest rivalry of the V10 era. How did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, for me, you've got two big beasts of that period. Okay, you might say that Mansell, like Matt characterised him, as the third wheel, but nevertheless, that's still top 3. So pretty good. And the thing for me is that they were teammates, and it kind of drove one of them, in this case Mansell, out of the team. And I feel like that element of like proper animosity, like, one guy kind of completely losing his mind because of just the dynamic, while racing obviously for a top team as well, a team that should have been capable of fighting for the championship. Like that raised it up for me. I placed quite a big premium on there being like proper needle with consequences, and the consequences of I'm going to quit. I think are kind of the pretty much the ultimate you can have. So that raised it up for me.
Matt, this ranked slightly higher for you than Mansell versus Senna. Well, why was that?
Like Ben says, the consequence. Now, middle of 1990, when Prost and Mansell are falling apart at Ferrari, and Ferrari seemed to be Mansell's ticket to actual greatness. After Williams went downhill, he seemed to be such a good fit for that team. It seemed like such a fairy tale starting, and then Prost turns up in the team, and it's like, oh, actually, I'm just going to beat you, and my way of working is going to really get under your skin. I'm going to drive you out of the team. Or Mansell interpreted Prost in the way that made him walk out of the team. But at that point, when Mansell's losing the plot of Ferrari, Williams is still kind of winning one race a year. There's no certainty necessarily that Williams is going to nail the driver aids to the extent that it does, that Renault's going to come good to the extent that it does, and Mansell can then get a dominant title. That could have been the Mansell story over because of the way Prost broke him at Team Mansell was just making his own. So consequence-wise, yeah, I don't think Mansell is in Prost's class any more than I think Mansell's in Senna's class. So the talent, but it was closer than a lot of people. But the consequences for Mansell, who, as much as I am not a fan, was an enormous character of the era, the consequences for Mansell were huge, and it could have turned out much worse. He could have left F1 without any titles at all, which even I would admit.
Yeah, ultimately he retired, didn't he, in the middle of 1990?
Well, exactly, yeah. And that was because of this rivalry and nothing else, basically.
It's a difficult one, this, because you have got that great animosity, and there's always the great knockabout stuff off track with Prost talking about, well, I was doing testing while he was playing golf and all that stuff, which is quite fun, and proper animosity. And, it did.
Well, you said it's about storylines, Ed.
But it did. Well, that's the thing, and it did have a big impact off track. But I felt on track it never quite became the thing it could have done or should have done. That's what this one's lacking for me, and.
You can't really name a famous Mansell versus Prost battle or sort of collision or anything like that, can you?
Yeah, that's the big problem, and it's really weird as well because like even in 1990, actually statistically, Mansell stacks up reasonably well against Prost. Prost is marginally the better, but equally, just in the overall way the season played out, Prost is comfortably the stronger Ferrari driver overall, which is just I think indicates the way that it was almost one off track, which is part of the game. You know, Mansell would argue that was the wrong way to do things, and playing politics, but that is part of the game of getting on top. And I think probably more than any of the others, Prost was the one that Mansell had the biggest problem with because of that, because he just couldn't quite keep up with him there. So yeah, it's not quite exploded on track. It's just gently simmered on track, and it's been quite a bit more combustible off track, but without ever quite getting into that very, very top tier. So again, very, very much if you were going purely on the sort of animosity generated and the way things work politically and off track, it would be a little bit higher. But yeah, the on track stuff lets it down for me.
I concede the on track element, like that is the bit that's missing. But in terms of like my definition, it kind of ticked all the others because it had high stakes, not necessarily for the championship, but for the like control of Ferrari or to be the big dog in one of the biggest teams. So that's as high
and
stakes.
And it blew up
much.
very quickly. You know, they were only together for half a season before Mansell had a meltdown.
Yeah, it was a flash fire, wasn't it? It wasn't like a slow burn, and it was enduring. Had the off track and element and the animosity, as we've mentioned, and had consequences like Matt outlined, the massive consequences of one of the top drivers just kind of mic dropping his way out of F1 and having to crawl his way back in and hope everything came together. So for me, it ticked so many boxes, but the fact it's not higher up is that on track element that I concede is fair.
Next up, in 7th, we have the first of many Michael Schumacher rivalries to appear in this list. And first up, we have his feud with Jacques Villeneuve. Ed had this up in 4th, Matt had it 7th, and Ben and I had it 8th. Ed, what made this the 4th biggest rivalry of the era for you?
I think it's just because there was such a mighty championship fight between the two of them and the way it ends. Because it's a little bit short-lived, but I think in terms of just pure narrative, on-track, consequential moments, I think if you were to ask any fan of Formula One during the Bring Back V10s era to name half a dozen of the most memorable or controversial, spectacular, it's Jerez, isn't it? So I think that just brute forces its way up towards the top of the list for me. So it's quite a simple one, and obviously they didn't have that many times when they were going wheel to wheel in that season, but just the storyline, the narrative just really makes this one a little bit more overpowered. And I think that narrative element is so important when it comes to rivalries. That's what gets it so high.
Shout out to whoever it is on Instagram that keeps saying we use the word narrative too much. You'll be happy with that.
all about narratives.
Bingo. Yeah, I agree. We're going back and looking back at storylines. The narrative's quite important. For me, I totally see your argument. If you have one enormous flashpoint where somebody gets themselves disqualified from a championship, trying to take the other guy out to win a championship, that can trump all. The reason it didn't for me was just that season, as we've discussed in our members only revisited series, was just so weird, where they were rarely on track together. They didn't have a kind of big head-to-head fight all season. However, they obviously had moments. You had things like Schumacher was very upset with Villeneuve for Estoril 96, where he overtook him. They kept falling out. Villeneuve and Schumacher were on opposing sides of the drivers' disagreement at Monza in 2000 over, should they neutralise the start. Villeneuve once he was not a rival on track, he was constantly taking shots at Michael off track. So I can see all of that. I actually felt quite betrayed in the end, because obviously as a brief Damon Hill fan in the 90s before 1995 happened, and then a long-term, still to this very day, Jacques Villeneuve fan, Schumacher was the enemy. And then I saw some footage. I think it's from 2004 when Villeneuve came back to drive the Renault, which Ed is constantly trying to get me to do an episode on. I keep refusing. But they have the delayed Suzuka qualifying or something. It must have been one of the typhoon years. And then they show the drivers getting together for the drivers' briefing. And Schumacher and Villeneuve are sat in the front row having a laugh and a joke together. And I'm going like, Jacques, you've betrayed me. I thought he was the enemy. So I guess the animosity didn't last in the end. Ben, you had this in 8th, the same place as me. Would that just mean that you totally agree with my summary?
Pretty much. I just think it was a bit too flash in the pan. Like, it's that one season, and yeah, it's got that amazing moment. But I also feel like that moment could have happened with Schumacher and anyone else. It just so happens that it's Villeneuve in that season.
Yeah, but
it's not so much about but it's not so much about the two of them and their rivalry. It's just about Williams versus Ferrari and that championship denouement. I don't think there's really anything enduring about Villeneuve versus Schumacher. Also, partly because then Williams completely drops off the cliff. And so I think then any kind of pot shots Villeneuve's throwing is more a rage against his own situation and the fact that he can't compete with Schumacher anymore. I don't think they were a competition of equals necessarily. And Villeneuve falling on different sides of debates later on to Schumacher. I mean, I feel like Villeneuve was on his own side of any debate compared to anyone else. Like, he tended to upset everybody in F1 at some point. So I kind of take that with a pinch of salt. To me, there's a little bit of like, we've done 1997. It's a great season. That's why we did a special series on it. And it's, a fantastic, balmy championship. And it makes the list because it's that one massively iconic season and championship fight. But it's one season wonder. And that's why it can't go up near the top for me.
You've touched on two things there that brought it down for me: the short-lived nature, and the fact that it just became obvious that Villeneuve wasn't in Schumacher's class. And I say that like it was a surprise because actually it was a surprise. When you look at, I say it so many times on this podcast, Melbourne '96 was so impressive. The Estoril '96 move was so impressive. Actually, going for it at Jerez '97 the way he did with everything at stake, those moments Villeneuve was doing things to Schumacher. I don't think anyone
else tries to make that move at Jerez.
Totally agree. But that's almost like why you feel, as someone who also was a Villeneuve fan for a while, then felt let down by him, why you feel like, oh, that wasn't real. The average Villeneuve level was not that. The highs were so bold and exciting and just willing to do things no one else would do. So why did you only do it like 5 times in your whole F1 career and then just say weird stuff in the paddock afterwards? That's why it came down for me, because actually if you take the best of Villeneuve and his attitude versus Schumacher, what a great storyline that could have been if it had like 5 years of that. But Williams couldn't sustain it, and neither could Villeneuve.
Let's move on before we have any more Villeneuve bashing on this show. We've got a run of Schumacher appearances now, and in 6th place, it's his rivalry that Matt was hoping would appear with Juan Pablo Montoya. We had a nice even split here. Matt and I had this 4th, while Ben and Ed only had it 9th. So, Matt, before we let the other two explain why they were wrong, why did this rank so highly for you?
Oh, that's terrible. I know it never became a real title fight, but to me, so it follows on beautifully from Villeneuve. I'm glad they're back to back in the list. Montoya was everything Villeneuve versus Schumacher should have been, because Montoya was exactly like Villeneuve, doing the moves no one else would do, having the bolshiness to try it on and off track, but had a bit more ability and a bit more, I don't say consistency in Montoya, but more so than Villeneuve in the end. He was showing like he could take the fight to Schumacher with a spirit that no one had since Villeneuve. Hakkinen could take the fight to Schumacher, I'm sure he might be mentioned later, in terms of speed and stuff, but without the level of rage and controversy and wheel banging. So this was what Villeneuve should have been. And it also, a theme I might mention a few times around the Schumacher points in this, like I was working by this time in low levels of journalism, but also still a fan at heart, really. And I respected Schumacher, but it was very, very, very monotonous in the first half of the 2000s. And anyone who gave hope of changing that storyline, not even from an anti-Schumacher perspective, just for a change of storyline perspective, I clung to excitedly. And Montoya gave so much hope of that, and they were falling out. And there were times when Schumacher just looked baffled and insulted by the moves Montoya was pulling off on him. And I love the fact a lot of them didn't work. And there were I think there's that Austria battle where Montoya's pointlessly trying to hold Schumacher off on woefully worn tyres, but he goes for it anyway and then just shoots off through the gravel trap and delays Schumacher in the process. And I was like, oh, that's hilarious and brilliant and unproductive, but I don't care. I don't think it could have become a proper championship fight because ultimately Montoya didn't quite have the top class to take it to Schumacher in the same way. Even in equal cars or equalish cars, it might have been another 97 style where Montoya might have won it, but you knew Schumacher was the better driver, really. But the high points of the rivalry were just so much fun.
Yeah, I think obviously I put it up in fourth like you did. I also see the Villeneuve similarities, but this one just won for me because it had a little bit more longevity. Like they had flashpoints over a number of years, and the fact that I think Montoya went into F1 wanting to rile Schumacher, wanting to wind him up, so he took every shot he could get. And yeah, I wouldn't for one moment say that these two were equal, and I'd totally agree with you. If they'd had a championship battle in relatively equal machinery, I don't think it would have sustained the length of a full season. But my criteria was just kind of, was this entertaining? Was there aggro? Were there great flashpoints on track? And this just had more of those than Villeneuve and Schumacher. Ed, it didn't quite do the same for you, though.
Well, this one's really frustrating because it's like a great book that's only half written. In that Montoya does come in, they pass it into Lagos. You have various incidents with aggro at the start of Malaysia in 2002, for example. There's various incidents between them. There's some clean passes, some ones that go a little bit wrong. There's all of this aggro sort of builds up, and it builds up to be like it's going to be a defining rivalry. And then it just sort of fizzles out because of the way the careers go and the relative competition. It sort of ends probably like a couple of years before it really ends. The last real flashpoint is that Imola one in 2004, isn't it? Where Montoya has that go around the outside of Tosa and he says Schumacher, well, you're either blind or stupid if you didn't know I was there. And but then it just fizzles out, and that's the thing that's so frustrating because they have loads of, there's loads of passes for major positions between the two of them, as well as all the incidents we remember, but it just runs out of steam. And I feel like all the setups there. It's like a TV series where it builds up really well, and then it turns out that they haven't.
You never get the payoff, do you?
Yeah, it's like you set it all up, but you don't really know where you're going, and you can't actually bring it home. And this one just stops. And it's partly because 05 was so poor for Ferrari, and then obviously Montoya sort of flounces off in 2006. But it's such a shame because everything that Matt said about what Montoya represented was there, but it just stopped, and that's so frustrating because this had everything except for actually fully happening. So annoying.
Yeah, to me it's quite similar in many ways to the Villeneuve Schumacher one, except instead of having that concentration into like one definitive season, it's kind of like just a hazy, not quite realised few moments that happen at scattered points across a longer period. But it just lacks clarity for me. That's the thing. It's like they're kind of overlapping, and yeah, sure, there's that desire from Montoya to kind of best Schumacher, but it's not a fight of equals. It's not really a fight of equal machinery either, and it just feels like it's a slightly lesser driver who's lacking focus, kind of sniping at the main guy, but never really quite achieving his aim of properly riling him or destabilising him. So yeah, just it's kind of a sequence of moments that happen across a long time span, and it lacks that kind of punch for me. But still obviously memorable because it made it a decent way into my list.
Now, earlier you heard me mention the new Bring Back V10s debrief we've been doing on Patreon. We did release the first episode of that series in full on our main feeds, but I thought we'd give you another taster of it as season 11 is coming to an end. So if you're worried about what am I going to do without any Bring Back V10s in my life for the next few months, this may be an option. So here's a clip from the debrief episode looking back on the 2002 US Grand Prix, where I took a load of questions from our members. The number of questions coming in for these shows has very quickly snowballed out of control from what I thought it would be. These shows are a Patreon exclusive. So if you're even a little bit curious about everything we've been doing over on Patreon, now's a great time to check it out while our special offer is running, where you can get 90% off your first month with us. As we record this, Ed has only just returned from F1 testing, where he, Scott Mitchell-Marl and John Noble were doing all sorts of little bite-sized exclusive bonuses every day, which our members over there on Patreon really love. So there'll be lots more of that during the season. So come join in with the fun. We've got a really nice community of fans building over there now, and it's well worth a look. The link is in the description as always, but here's a little snippet then from me answering questions about Indy 2002. Liam Scully is next, saying, out of all the drivers on the grid that day, excluding ex-Indy drivers, who do you think would have the best chance of winning the Indy 500? Liam says, side note, loving these debrief episodes. I especially like the fact I forget what question I asked by the time the episode comes out. Well, now you'll be reminded, Liam, of what your question was. I wonder what your answer is, because off the top of my head, this is very difficult, especially as I started reading it. I was thinking, well, this is easy. I'll just say Montoya or Villeneuve, but you've ruled them out. And I can't even cheat and say Fernando Alonso as a future Indy driver because he wasn't on the grid that day. I think when we did Indy 2001, maybe there was a thing where Hakkinen and Michael Schumacher got asked if they would ever go to Indy, and they said they didn't fancy it. So I guess even though they were two of the best drivers on the grid in this era, and obviously Mika was gone by this point, you'd have to say you probably can't choose Schumacher because he wouldn't have fancied it. So let's say Kimi Räikkönen. He was always pretty fearless and tended not to care too much. So yeah, I think especially early years Kimi could have gone to Indy and gone well. I remember when we did one of our episodes where we spoke to veteran IndyCar journalist Kurt Cavan. He told a story about the first time Montoya drove an IRL car at the Speedway in 2000. He kind of got out and went, well, that's not very quick, is it? So they were still using those cars at the time. So I think Räikkönen would have got in one of those cars and been massively underwhelmed, but probably have done quite a good job. On to our top 5 then, and this is one of the combinations I was most fascinated by to see where it would end up before we started this process. It's Michael Schumacher versus Ayrton Senna. This was a short-lived rivalry, like some of the others we've talked about. And I guess were it not for the events of Imola 94, you've got to think this would be a contender for the top of the list. But they did have some fun flare-ups, primarily in 1992. There was a disagreement that year at the Brazilian Grand Prix where Senna's driving upset Schumacher. Then we had the famous public dressing down Senna gave Schumacher on the grid during a red flag at the French Grand Prix. Then they came to blows in a test at Hockenheim after they kept tripping over each other on track. Now, back in December 2024, some fan footage emerged of them messing about with each other in the stadium section on a few occasions. Go and look for that. The original version that I shared when it first appeared, that got taken down. I don't know why. I don't know if the person who uploaded it got scared or something. But this being the age of the internet, loads of people ripped it, so you can still find it. I had this rivalry up in 3rd. Ben had it 5th. Matt had it 6th. And Ed had it 7th. So we got a nice kind of staircase there, haven't we? Ben, how did you go about placing this one, given that this feud was ultimately cut short before it could truly explode?
Yeah, there's an element of logical inconsistency to my argument here. Having just talked about Montoya and Schumacher, being about potential and it not being fully realised, that also applies here. Like, there's a certain extra weight, I think, though, to it, because the fact it was a proper fight of equals. You had the pretender and the master. Senna felt properly threatened by Schumacher, I think, and then you saw that beginning to play out before the events of Imola. That's the point at which my fandom of Formula One is properly taking off as well. So I started very much with it's Schumacher versus Senna, and then the rest. And you could just sense immediately there was like a proper iconic, massive battle building. And yeah, it gets cut short. But I think there's no danger that had things been different, had Senna lived, this would have endured. This would have gone on through that period and become one probably much higher on my list of these rivalries. Whereas the Montoya Schumacher thing just played out kind of, we know how it played out, and it wasn't quite hitting the mark. This would have hit the mark, no doubt. So I think we can extrapolate from the potential that this was a more defined, more important, more consequential rivalry than others that are similar but lower down the list.
Yeah, I think for me it's that the what we missed out on is kind of I've kind of given placed that in favour of this one. I've given that massive what if has kind of made me score this one more highly. Ed, you had it lowest of all of us, down in 7th. Is that just because almost the opposite of what I just said, because it didn't get to develop into what it should have? Is that why you marked it down?
Yeah, it's too much what if, unfortunately. It's a real shame that it didn't play out for many reasons. But it had started really well, ramped up nicely, particularly with that Manicourt stuff with Senna lecturing Schumacher. And I feel like they kind of built the framework, the foundation perhaps on which to build the rivalry, and then it was just cut short, which is a shame because they were two drivers who were equals. They could have had several years of really fantastic championship battles, and we got just like the start of it in '94, and then of course it just tragically ended. So yeah, that just takes the sting out of the tail of it for me, unfortunately, because it just didn't play out.
For me, it's, even though it wasn't long and it didn't have that many actual on-track flashpoints, it's the weight with which it kind of looms over the last few years of Senna's life and looms over his aftermath for a little while as well that makes it quite a powerful one still. You know, a lot of my kind of core understanding of Senna comes from Richard Williams from our sister podcast and Colossi, That's History, his book The Death of Ayrton Senna, which, you know, there's lots of books about Ayrton Senna. That one is spectacularly good and so evocative. And
Agreed.
you sort of sense the Schumacher thing rising in Senna through the final part of that book as Mansell disappears, Prost disappears, and, you know, they both started F1 half a decade before Senna, so you just got this crossover, and it's clear this is the next Senna story, and Senna knows it, and it's even before Schumacher's anywhere near a car where he can be a consistent problem for Senna, he's a problem in Senna's head. And then the degree to which what Schumacher and Benetton are doing together haunts the kind of last few races of Senna's life and career is really powerful in that Senna storyline. And then thinking back to like being a fan in '94, and also like everything you read, whenever I read back anything from mid '94, until Hill got going, there's that emptiness when in those kind of that couple of months after Senna's death, where it's not just like F1's lost Ayrton Senna, it's like who is going to stop Schumacher winning every championship in the conceivable future with Senna gone, because Schumacher is so clearly that much better than everybody else. And until like Hill and Hakkinen find their feet, it just feels like, okay, without Senna, no one can stop Schumacher at all. So he's kind of there. The presence is there still almost. Ed, you said there have been fantastic championship fights. My only worry with this rivalry is they were both at their worst dirty. And I just feel like if they're going to run of championship fights, we're going to have a run of championship deciders with both of them in the pit wall at the start of a race weaving at each other, and it would have just got unpleasant.
Sign me up.
Yeah, mega. That's ultimate rivalry.
Then it would have been
if it plays out, this is number one.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, then it would have been number. So for me, it's the thing that, because everything you say is correct, but it just didn't happen. That's the big. It's like Moss versus Clark never properly happened, and that means it just takes it off the table as a great rivalry, even though it should have happened. And that's the, well, it doesn't take it off the table as a great rivalry, but it diminishes it as a great rivalry in this case, I would say. So yeah. It's just such a. It's such a shame. I mean, if we were doing the great what ifs, it's right up there. But yeah,
I'm sure we'll get to that at some point.
Yeah, but I still think there's enough about it that actually did happen, or was just so dominant in the storyline that it was about to happen that it makes it, yes, okay, a what if, but a what if where you got quite a bit of the if. It's not like a Lewis Hamilton Michael Schumacher crossover that's a proper what if. A lot of this had begun happening. And then, yeah, obviously we didn't get the proper storyline, but we got an okay enough percentage of it for it to be part of F1 legend.
It's a 75% written book rather than a 50% written book, to use Ed's,
no, it's not.
Ed's analogy from
no,
before.
I'd say it's sub 50.
You'd say sub 50.
Yeah,
maybe 75% of it is predictable. Then I think what we're saying.
I reckon you've got the classic 3-act structure. You've got Act 1 written, so you've got all the build up.
You've set the scene.
You start Act 2 because they're going head to head for the championship, and then bang, Imola happens, which is, for so many reasons, it's just such a tragedy, such a shame.
Okay, in 4th place we have a different kind of rivalry. I'd say Michael Schumacher versus Mika Hakkinen. I'd say different kind of rivalry in that they never really fell out. This was based more on respect than animosity. The rivalry, of course, peaked from 98 to 2000. There's a couple of championship fights in there. The roots do go further back than that. To, you can point to a Formula 3 clash at Macau, and probably their most famous moment together is Hakkinen's epic pass for the win at Spa in 2000, which we've covered with Mika's help. That came just after Schumacher had tried to put him on the grass at the same place. Ed had this one second, Matt had it third, and Ben and I had it sixth. Ed, you can go first here. What made this the second biggest rivalry of the era for you?
Well, it was a rivalry that consumed a few years of Formula One. I think you've got two drivers who are equals, really. I think Hakkinen, you could argue, was quicker than Schumacher, but he was a little bit more variable in his level, whereas Schumacher was kind of always there, getting close to his maximum. It had those flashpoints like Spa, and obviously the famous conversation after it. They were fighting for championships. You had Suzuka 98. So for me, it just has everything. And I think if you were to pick the greatest rival of Schumacher, a 7-time world champion, it is Hakkinen. And if you pick the greatest rival of Hakkinen, a 2 times world champion, it's Schumacher. So for me, it just ticks all of those boxes. Even though they didn't have a Jerez 97 moment, they had sort of versions of that, but slightly lower levels. So for me, it's one that dominated Formula One for that window. Admittedly, it wasn't like a 10-year rivalry; it was kind of localized. But for me, it just had that intense, constant battle. It was almost lap by lap by lap through that period. It was all about Schumacher versus Hakkinen, and they had so many great duels, both wheel to wheel and also just those ones where you're just putting in pulverising pace in sprints between pit stops. So many races like that, which I just think means it puts it right up there.
And Schumacher, I think, has always said that Hakkinen was his favourite rival. Ben, you're more towards you're exactly where I felt it was, 6th place. So it's not even in the top half for me and you. Why is that for you?
Big part of it is the word you just mentioned, favourite. The fact that Schumacher kind of liked Hakkinen, taking that, not having that animosity, that aggro, that really takes a sting out of it for me. For me, this is the top of the nice rivalries. I mentioned Mansell and Senna and their respect earlier. I feel like this just pips that in my ranking because of the other things that it endured for a bit longer. They were properly going for the championship. That element of it going back a little bit beyond, back further than their F1 careers as well. So they were kind of peers properly coming up the single-seater ladder. But it's just too nice. It didn't have that proper needle. For it to be a top 5 or even top 3 rivalry, you've got to have some proper needle in there, and this just didn't have that.
Yeah, that's what it is for me. I respect this rivalry, and I respect the respect they had for each other. Yeah. But I judge a rivalry on, I want controversy. I want needle. I want the guys to not like each other. So it moved up a bit compared to if this had been a nice, respectful rivalry that involved perhaps one lesser driver and Schumacher, it may not have even got in, but it kind of had to get in for the weight of their talent. I would also say, ultimately, because of what happened in 99 when Schumacher broke his leg, this was really a 2 championship fight rivalry. We had 98, and then where Hakkinen had the car advantage, had 2000 that was a bit more equal. But before that, they didn't really have any run-ins before they became championship rivals in F1. And after it, Hakkinen was burnt out by 2001, so the rivalry by then was gone again. Matt, we're 3rd place for you, so it's on your podium. So unlike me and Ben, can you look past the kind of lack of animosity?
Yes, purely because, Schumacher is clearly the benchmark of most of the V10s era, and once Senna's gone, Hakkinen's the only person Schumacher comes up against where it's like, oh, he might actually be faster than you, Michael. And that is a really powerful thing for me. The sheer fact that out of everyone Schumacher comes up against, he can look at Hakkinen and be a little bit like, I might not actually have him covered in equal cars. The lack of animosity pulls it down a little bit, but Spa 2000, Hakkinen did animosity in his own Finnish way there. That was nice. But also,
that's just a flashpoint.
That's the problem, though. He kept it behind closed doors. That's
true.
liked him as well.
But I kind of liked the quiet menace of that. It kind of let you know that if they were going to fall out, Hakkinen would sort it. He just wouldn't talk about it much afterwards. You might just have to look at the body language. I wish I could have put it a little bit higher still because it had the potential, but Hakkinen just it felt like it all took more out of Hakkinen to even be part of this than it took out of Schumacher. Like you say, he got burnt out. He made a lot more mistakes in that time. I don't think McLaren helped him with reliability or with teammate clashes and stuff as well. So he made slightly heavy weather of it. But we'll always have Spa 2000, and I love that little stint in Nürburgring in '98 where you feel like Ferrari's just got Hakkinen where it wants him. Schumacher's going to steal this title, and Hakkinen does put the move on Irvine, catches Schumacher, jumps in the pit stops with sheer speed, and it's like, oh yeah, this is why Schumacher is a little bit unnerved by you because you can do this.
I do quite like the simmering in the background elements of it as well, because I always say there wasn't much animosity. Well, Schumacher was willing to risk putting Hakkinen up a tree in Belgium, wasn't he? And that creates quite a bit of needle. And of course, even though it was fairly localised, it's also got that slightly grander pitch because you can go all the way back to Macau, can't you? And what happened there in the F3 Grand Prix? So yeah,
but they were just two moments in time, weren't they? It's not like it endured that level of animosity or needle endured all the way through. I think that does really let it down.
But it was still something. It wasn't just purely localised. There was an origin story, if you want to call it that. And I think it was because it was two proper heavyweight F1 drivers slugging it out. You don't get that many battles, even though it was, like you say, it was really only 2 seasons. You don't get that many championship fights. Like we talked about Villeneuve Schumacher, there wasn't so much on track. Whereas Hakkinen and Schumacher in that period, most races they tended to be going at it in some way, shape or form, even if it was sometimes just a pure pace race. So that's why I like that one so much. And yeah, I think Schumacher always was a little bit unsure how to deal with Hakkinen because he didn't rise to it in the same way publicly. Like it's easier to deal with a Montoya or a Villeneuve, whereas Hakkinen was just a slightly different kind of contender. And while that maybe slightly dents the grander narrative, I think it makes it a massively, massively fascinating one as well, which is, it just gives it great depth.
Let's move on to our top 3 then. On the bottom step of the podium, it's a different kind of rivalry, one between teams. It's McLaren versus Ferrari. This one blew hot and cold through the era, let's be honest. They fought for the 1990 championship when Senna and Prost were on opposite sides of that divide, but they didn't have a direct title fight again until Schumacher and Hakkinen in 1998, and that started a run of 3 consecutive really close year-long battles. Then McLaren's challenge faded as the 21st century began, although Kimi Räikkönen did nearly pip Schumacher and Ferrari to the 2003 crown, although I'd say that was by stealth rather than outright pace. Ben had this number 1 on his list. Matt had it 2nd, Ed had it 5th, and I didn't include it. But Ben, we'll start with you. The biggest rivalry of the V10 era.
Yeah, so for me, this goes to the top because it kind of encapsulates all the other rivalries. It's like the foundational rivalry that kind of allows all the other ones to happen, and it goes, right back to the, early 70s, mid 70s between the teams. Yeah, there are moments where it kind of rises and falls, but it's always there. And then you have kind of this massive, like iconic flashpoint between 2 drivers fighting for the championship in 1990. And then you've always got other elements coming in, like, needle between the personnel, needle between the teams technically over things they're doing with the cars. You've got Ron Dennis and you've got Ross Brawn later. You've got the Hakkinen Schumacher element that defines that bit in the late 90s and into the 2000s. So, yeah, it had the enduring element, the high stakes, it had much wider consequences, and it had just massive endurance. So, as well as needle, there was proper needle between the teams at different points, and drivers within the teams and personnel within the team. So for me, it kind of has everything.
Matt, you weren't far off putting it top, and there was, clearly some outrage in your laughter there when I said it wasn't in for me. Anything to add on top of what Ben said there?
No, it's not a rivalry that I feel particularly fond of because, kind of Ron Dennis versus Jean Todt spat is like, can you just go and have this in a box somewhere? And if that box floats out to sea, oh well, never mind. It's character-wise, they were. The ways they went about their business were hard to love at times for both of them. However, it does define so much of the era, and it's more enduring than any other team rivalry that there was because Williams faded so much. It does go on and off track. In the Senna, Mansell, Prost three-wheeler era, Ferrari's there as the place someone could go if they're not going to be teammates. It's there just kind of the lurking, getting in the way presence, making things spicier than if it was all McLaren. And then kind of similar, actually, Ferrari's there later on when McLaren's building really good cars, going, actually, maybe you building really good cars isn't enough. And it underpins so much. It goes into so many different territories because I think the characters of the teams wind the drivers up in them as well to make some of these situations even more fractious. So no one's going to look back at that kind of as evocatively as they will some of the driver-on-driver rivalries, but just play such a big part in all of them. Not such a big part, I'll put it first. That's a proper Ben classic move in this Top 10 podcast. But it's a big lurking theme in an awful lot of the other things we're talking about. So I had to put it quite high.
I think the one thing that meant it was a tiny bit lower for me is everything that's been said there is correct. But the Ferrari versus McLaren one is just a much bigger rivalry. This era's, 17 years of a 55 year rivalry. I think they had 5 times they finished first and second in the Constructors' Championship in the Bring Back V10s era, and the 14 times they've done it, including in 2024. So it's massive in this era, but it's also, that's just a few chapters of something a little bit broader, which meant it didn't quite get in amongst the 4 ones that I felt really ticked every single box. So it's just because it's distilling that rivalry down into a smaller period in this. So it's difficult because it's the one team rivalry, so that maybe changes things a little bit because you don't have the same personal animosity, but then you have the big grander animosity between multiple people as well. So I certainly wouldn't argue with it. I think you could put it number 1, you could leave it out, and you can justify both in this particular debate.
Well, allow me to now justify the other side then. Yeah, I'll be really interested when we put this out to our members on Patreon, and we're going to let you guys suggest rivalries that we haven't included. I'll quickly say that obviously we mentioned that Schumacher and DC was 11th. The only other one on the shortlist that didn't make it in was Johnny Herbert versus Flavio Briatore. So maybe we'll talk about that a bit more for our members. But I'm really interested to see, when we get suggestions from our members, if other team rivalries get in. This was the only team rivalry we put on the shortlist. I just couldn't quite get excited enough about it. And I think it's because, yes, that from my research, usually if there was off-track stuff going on between McLaren and Ferrari, it tended to be Ron Dennis being annoyed at Ferrari about something, Jean Todt not really rising for it, and then Ross Brawn kind of patronising Ron in a kind of, well, I don't think you actually understand what's going on here. So I sort of get that. But when they were actually going at it for championships, I didn't view those really as proper iconic McLaren versus Ferrari seasons. They were about the drivers. So 1990 is Senna versus Prost. It's not McLaren versus Ferrari to me. And then, 98 to 2000. I can see that a bit more because you've got the kind of crazy 99 in the middle where Schumacher goes away. And, they were kind of taking some shots at each other from a legality point of view. I totally understand the argument. The reason it's not in for me is that I couldn't get excited enough about it as a head-to-head rivalry in the same way I can when it's individuals. So just, a rivalry between organisations just doesn't excite me in quite the same way. Or I would say the bar is higher. There would have to be more controversy. I guess, if Spygate was included in the V10 era, perhaps you could, that would get it over the line. But I would expect a rivalry between teams has to do more for me to include it.
I feel like that era as well is the team rivalries exist, but not quite in the same way as maybe they do today in Formula One.
It's not Red Bull Mercedes, is it?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's slightly evolved in that regard, and this one lacks. I mean, what we probably needed really is for the McLaren motorhome and the Ferrari motorhome to have a collision in the paddock. That's what we needed in this period to elevate it. But I think if we were doing Bring Back whatever's going on now in 25 years' time, I think it might be a little bit different. like you say, Red Bull, Mercedes, just because I think just the way people engage with the sport, with Formula One specifically, is a lot more. There seems to be a lot more sort of team fans. I mean, yeah, there were always Ferrari fans. I'm not saying there were no sort of McLaren fans and Williams fans in that era, but it feels to me that that's changed a little bit now. I mean, it's all been ramped up, so you get an even more intense driver fandom. But I feel like just my completely anecdotal, vibes-based Matt Beer feel of the era is that you had that a little bit more for drivers than teams maybe at this period, even though probably Ferrari, well, certainly Ferrari were the one that probably had the most fans as a team in that period. So it's kind of a slightly different type of rivalry, this one, isn't it? Because of the time and the fact it's teams.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's sort of special even within that grouping, and that's what lifted it up for me. It's the thing that Matt talked about, the underpinnings of it, the fact that it kind of encapsulates so much, and even going beyond. I know, Spygate's disqualified because it happens too late for this period, but that it all plays in to kind of, when you look back, you can't. It's difficult to look back in complete isolation and not consider wider consequences or how things endured even beyond that period. And there's no rivalry quite like it. It encapsulates so much, is involved in so many things, has so many moments where people are going from one to the other, different bits of animosity between different employees within that team at different times. Like, there's so much to it that kind of, it's not exciting in quite the same way, but it's a key part of so much excitement over so much of Formula One history. So that lifts it up for me.
What you're saying is it needed more exciting photocopying within the Bring Back V10s era, and that developed.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, Glenn, I think it would have got into Glenn's list if that photocopying had happened a few years earlier.
Probably, but while you were talking about it, it was to the wider public. It was two essentially faceless individuals, handing over a dossier. So yeah, I what I would say when Ed was talking about how the modern framing of F1 has changed. I think if we'd had Netflix cameras behind the scenes during this era, we'd have probably known a lot more about how much McLaren and Ferrari hated each other at various points during their rivalry. Let's move on to second place, which edged out McLaren and Ferrari by just 5 points. So I guess that's my fault, because I didn't vote for McLaren and Ferrari. But that means second place goes to Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill. This scrap was defined, I would say, by collisions. Mostly started with the 94 title deciding clash in Adelaide, then two high profile but ultimately clumsy clashes that I think I'll be interested to see if we can all agree they were Hill's fault in 1995. Then a few more fallings out along the way. What I liked about this one was that even once they weren't fighting for championships anymore, there were those little postscript moments. We talked in our 97 Revisited series for our members club about how Hill massively balked Schumacher at the end of that year's Japanese Grand Prix when Schumacher was on course to win that race. He's been hunted down behind Sam Frentzen, comes up to lap Damon Hill, and Damon just massively gets in the way for a lap when Schumacher's got a championship on the line. There's Canada the following season where Hill's like weaving at Schumacher down the back straight, and Schumacher was furious about that. So I like the fact that, Damon, I think you said you'd spoken to Damon about Suzuka, Ben, and he said, I'm not a very good bad boy, was the quote. But he did try, which I liked. So I had this second on my list. Damon Hill fans, Ben and Ed, had it third. Matt only put it fifth. So, Matt, I'm going to come to you first. Why only fifth?
Because Hill wasn't good enough. I'm going to be blunt. Sorry. I love this rivalry because F1 needed it so much post-Senna. Like I said earlier, at that point where you think, Schumacher's going to win everything forever. Hill really rises to it. And just the circumstances the following year of Williams having a good car and Hill not making the best use of that good car, F1 became an interesting sporting storyline to the wider public way quicker than you thought it would post-Senna. And that was down to Schumacher versus Hill and a different characters, a bit of kind of traditional sort of British driver versus German driver, a little bit of an uncomfortable nation versus nation thing there, but it did seem to galvanise people. But you always knew Damon wasn't really in Schumacher's class to an even greater extent than some of the other Schumacher versus someone rivalries. And that's not to say Damon was a bad driver, because he really wasn't. And at his best, his best races were so good. And he does deserve his championship. I wouldn't begrudge him that at all. But you always knew that Schumacher, in any kind of straight fight, would win that. So that pulls it down. The sheer storyline level of it pulls it up. And I love how often afterwards, like you say, Damon found an excuse to balk Schumacher, or the weaving in Montreal was just so rubbish and bad. But the balking was always quite funny, and fair play to him for that. That's human, isn't it? But I just wish Damon had been a bit closer to Schumacher's level.
That's fair enough. Ben, I feel like our listeners know that we put you through the ringer quite a lot whenever there's a Schumacher versus Hill episode. I'm always going to make sure you're the first name on the team sheet. Does the pain of living this rivalry as a passionate Damon Hill fan, is that why you couldn't rank it higher? I was curious before we started this, if you just go, this was the biggest thing for me in F1, it had to be number one. But is it too painful to put it too high?
A little bit. There's a little bit of the pain of it. There's a little bit of objectivity in that, the fundamental point that Matt was making, that it wasn't quite a fight of equals. Like, that does drag it down. Like, you need them to be kind of both on absolutely the same level all the time, and they just weren't. I think Damon did a great job of stepping into that Senna Schumacher void that we talked about earlier, and raised his level beyond probably what he thought was possible. So that it was a great rivalry that Formula One needed, and ticks every box for me. Apart from the fact that it's just slightly imbalanced. So compared to Prost, Senna, and then you almost have to set McLaren and Ferrari aside because we're not quite comparing the same thing here. But yeah, I couldn't put it above Prost, Senna for me because that really was a fight of equals. And
spoiler for what our number one is there as well.
We're getting to the point where it's difficult to protect the future, isn't it? but yeah, I mean, obviously it was a massive part of my fandom of Formula One, the Hill Schumacher thing. But even as a Hill fan, those clashes that you mentioned, Glenn, I can't defend Damon in '95 as much as I'd like to. He just felt like it was just another crack in his armour as that season went on. So, and those incidents kind of encapsulate the fact that he was almost trying too hard to be something he wasn't quite, which is a shame, because if he had just been a little bit more robust, a little bit quicker, then maybe this would have been the enduring rivalry of the V10 era. Certainly would have been a closer contest.
Yeah, I think this one was certainly probably the rivalry I kind of experienced the most, if you like, as a Hill fan. So yeah, for all the reasons that have been mentioned, it was a really great one. But yeah, it was never. There was always the fact that Schumacher did have that edge and that advantage, but I think it does characterise a period of Formula One, and as has been said, much needed rivalry as well. Which I think means that even if you make it a completely 100% objective thing, it's an important rivalry. I couldn't put it above the Schumacher Hakkinen rivalry personally, because I felt that was a little bit more a more defining one for both of those drivers in terms of their opponents. But yeah,
there was only one World Championship fight as well, wasn't it? When you think about it, it was kind of 94, 95, I suppose. But really, Schumacher kind of went on to dominate it, really, because it all kind of imploded. So it doesn't have as many kind of repeated battles in it as Hakkinen Schumacher did.
Yeah, it doesn't have quite the same.
By '96, he's at Ferrari and they're no good. So
yeah, it's not quite that same sustained intensity, but it's a brilliantly storied one. Obviously, Adelaide '94 elevates it from that perspective as well. So it's probably the most personal number one for me, if you like, in terms of how I experienced it. In fact, I can't remember if I told this story before, but I was must have been the Nürburgring in 2013, and just having done the paddock ramblings, you wander around, you talk to people in the paddock to find out what's going on in the race, and I dived into the McLaren motorhome after doing that before going up to the media centre, because the end of the Wimbledon final was on. It was Andy Murray against Novak Djokovic, and it was getting right towards the end, so obviously Andy Murray winning Wimbledon was a big thing, and I ended up basically stood by Damon Hill watching the last 10 minutes or whatever of this, and he was like living every point, and it's like, oh God. And it was really funny. I said to him, you do realise this was what you were doing to us all back in your day. And I just remember just saying, in that case, I just most profoundly apologise, which was a very, very Damon Hill thing to say. But I just thought it was quite. I thought it was really funny to see somebody who you remember having that effect on what you were doing, all the good moments, the bad moments, and everything, and seeing him react to another sort of athlete who he's supporting there was really an interesting and memorable moment. It's a complete digression, but it's a nice little story.
That's an excellent digression.
That's a great digression. The thing that really chimed me when you were saying that was Hill's kind of surprise, almost, that he would have had that effect on fans and other people, that it just didn't sit obviously to him. And in some ways, it should diminish the storyline that Hill's career was so weird. The fact that, a guy who spent a billion years in Formula 3000 not really getting anywhere, and then was like tugging around with a really bad Brabham in '92, and like 2 years later is in this incredible storyline and properly taking it to Schumacher and Suzuka and Adelaide at the end of '94. Amazing. Now you could look at that and go, that shows Hill was a bit of an imposter because look at his career up to that point, and it could diminish the rivalry. Or you look at it and go, wow. Someone who didn't even really see themselves in that sort of position in life, elevating themselves to take on Schumacher in that storyline is just incredible.
Okay, let's move on to number one then, which I was going to say by this point, I imagine is no surprise to anyone, but we've actually given it away. But I doubt that has ruined your experience too much of this episode. You will also not be shocked to learn that our number one won by a massive margin. It is, of course, Ayrton Senna versus Alain Prost. I'm sure everybody could have guessed that before we even cast our votes. It almost got a clean sweep from all of us. Me, Ed and Matt all put this at number one. As we know, Ben put McLaren versus Ferrari number one. So this was in second place for him, denying a full score for Senna versus Prost. Ed, let's come to you first. Was this an easy number one pick?
Yeah, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because it's just so obvious, but it ticks every box, doesn't it? It's got the animosity, it's got the significance, all of those things, the flashpoints, the Imola '89 with the no overtaking thing, and then the Suzukas, etc., etc. Everybody knows that off by heart. And I think the key thing is it has just become, in the past decade or so, more than a decade actually, I guess probably going back to the Senna film.
Yeah, which is 15 years ago now.
Amazing, isn't it? Yeah, I remember seeing that in Sao Paulo. Remarkable. Yeah, so that's elevated it. That's elevated it massively. And I think it's also distorted it, but this isn't the top 10 most accurately regarded in the popular imagination rivalries. It's the greatest rivalries. And I think that just means it blows everything else out of the water. I think it's the rivalry that most people in Formula One, certainly in certain terms of looking back historically, would name and think of. It's absolutely transcended Formula One. It's transcended motorsport. And it's one of, I think if you're doing a top 10 greatest sporting rivalries, it would be in there of all sports. So for me, it just, it waltzes in and it wins this particular vote by a lap, to be quite honest. It's for so many obvious reasons, so I won't keep prattling on about it because I think everybody knows them.
Yeah, it's got genuine animosity. Like, there was hatred. I like the fact that they fell out as teammates, but the feud kept going afterwards. That's something that Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg didn't have, because Rosberg retired once he'd finally beaten him. Imagine if Rosberg had gone to, I guess, Ferrari would be the comparison, and then they'd carried on feuding and crashed into each other in opposing teams as well. And then you had all the falling out behind the scenes, political battling to get into Williams and all that sort of stuff. Again, much like Ed, I won't claim all of the nuggets of what makes this great. Matt, I will second what Ed said. Really, when I was writing this list, sometimes I build up to number one. This time I put this one in at number one and then worked everything else out afterwards. What was your process?
Very similar. I started kind of chronologically, and then I kind of knocked them around if one is bigger than the other in my mind, but this was completely uncontested. It just defined what a F1 rivalry could be. It was just bigger than any that had come before and bigger than any that have come since. Genuinely, because it was so long as well. It was two people who just couldn't actually conceive of how the other even thought or approached their racing or how they functioned. They were so different in that regard. nothing like it. Any time you get people falling out with each other since, at least they can at least you feel that their brains come from the same place. These two were barely the same species of racing driver, and yet were so comparable in their talent. And so that's why it's head and shoulders above in this era and any other.
Nothing like it, according to Matt Beer, but unless you're Ben Anderson, in which case it's not as interesting as McLaren and Ferrari.
Yeah, well, if you're making a slightly hipster left field argument for anything other than this, I've tried to do it. My only logic was that, as I said before, McLaren and Ferrari kind of is an umbrella for all of this, and including this rivalry. This happened between them as well as Senna and Prost. Encapsulates both teams as opposition as well. But if you discount McLaren and Ferrari as this kind of special case, then yeah, obviously it's next in my list. So it is number one. It's the obvious pick. I think the fact that Senna died at Imola in '94 kind of probably propels it a little bit more in terms of the mythology, because you don't have the opportunity over the past. Well, it's over 30 years now, isn't it? To have the two of them reminiscing about it, talking about it.
We'd have got
giving both
reconciliation,
sides.
wouldn't we? It was heading that way.
Yeah, exactly, and that would, I think, would have taken the sting out of it massively. Part of the Senna film popularity and a key part of the narrative. I watched it in Guildford, I think, is
I watched it in London.
Is that you have this almost hatchet job against Prost, and you have a kind of fan's view of how Senna felt rather than his own interpretation. So that kind of in many ways lifts it. You don't have kind of Senna going, actually, 20 years down the line, I quite like Prost. Yeah, and we were gonna go and play some tennis or something. Once we knew that he wanted Prost to come back, and that they were talking. So there was a thawing, like you say. But you just don't have the closure, and in some way that helps lift it in terms of the mythology.
I think that little hint of the rapprochement in the final months of Senna's life, and the chat in the Imola paddock, and I think Prost talked about there being a few phone conversations as well over that winter.
Senna was ringing him up, telling him he missed him and that sort of thing.
I love you, Alain. Please come back.
I just find it really interesting that, for Ben, that takes the sting out of it. For me, that I love that there's this weird extra chapter that we didn't quite get. I would have kind of liked the idea of them going, well, we're two old guys now and we don't really mind, but wasn't it fun at the time? Like, that would have been a good kind of put a bow on the story for me.
Yeah, and it also underlines an eternal truth I think you get in sport, in that it's such a weird environment, particularly elite sport with the watching world. We talk about Prost and Senna hating each other, and yeah, they had very different ways of approaching things, but I don't think fundamentally that means they're people who had to hate each other. It's just in that environment. And then sometimes you do have that enduring dislike, but often once out of that competition it kind of peels away, which is why you hear plenty of sports rivalries like this do turn into a certain degree of friendship, and certainly the respect's there. So I think that adds a little bit, because it shows that deep down under all of it, they did have enormous respect for each other, and they were kind of worthy adversaries to each other as well.
Yeah, I think we can leave it there. We've gone on for long enough. We talk about Senna and Prost a lot on Bring Back V10s. We could devote a whole episode to them, but much like Ed's suggestion earlier that we should do 3 or 4 years of research for Montoya versus Ralf Schumacher, I can't even begin to imagine trying to put together some sort of Senna-Prost opus. It would have to be a whole series about them. So before we sign off, let's have a rundown of our top 10 rivalries of the V10 era. 10th place was Ralf Schumacher and Juan Pablo Montoya. Number 9 was Nigel Mansell and Ayrton Senna. Number 8 was Nigel Mansell and Alain Prost. Number 7 was Michael Schumacher and Jacques Villeneuve. Number 6 was Michael Schumacher and Juan Pablo Montoya. Number 5 was Michael Schumacher and Ayrton Senna. Number 4 was Michael Schumacher and Mika Hakkinen. Number 3 was McLaren and Ferrari. Number 2 was Michael Schumacher versus Damon Hill. And number 1, of course, was Ayrton Senna versus Alain Prost. It's always Senna versus Prost, isn't it? I don't really see it. I don't imagine it as Prost versus Senna. Are we in agreement on that, at least?
No, I agree with you on that. Yeah,
yeah, Senna Prost.
That gives the ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, one was louder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, put the understated guy second. Anyway, thanks to Matt, Ed and Ben for taking part in our latest top 10 debate. Remember, if you're with us on Patreon, you'll soon be able to put forward your suggestions for rivalries we missed. If you're not a member, now's a great time to check it out, where you can get 90% off before the F1 season starts. While season 11 of Bring Back V10s is now over, you'll still be hearing from us pretty much weekly in the Race Members Club. We'll be doing bonus Q&A shows. We've got our Murray's Magic Moments special that we'll be doing for our members. We've got another revisited series where we're going to go back through another classic season in full. So there's going to be loads for you. You can pretty much get Bring Back V10s episodes all year round now if you're part of the members club. And for everybody else, we'll see you in July for season 12.